Well, everybody has your bio in the invitation, but let me just quickly review it, it's an incredible background. As everybody knows, I think Ali is an MSNBC columnist, the host of Velshi on MSNBC on Saturday and Sunday mornings from 8 to 10. Fabulous 2 hours. If you haven't seen it, I recommend it highly. Ali's also a business correspondent for NBC News, a columnist for MSNBC, a weekly economics contributor to NPR's Here and Now. And as you know, he walks into lions' dens, both literally and figuratively. And figuratively, I remember 08, 09, a lot of us slept not fabulously, but better because of you. Ali, you described a real crisis in the global financial system. We nearly went under. And you were calm, you were understandable in your explanation. So I thank you for that. Now, literally, you've been in the lion's den lately. As we all know, you have been in Ukraine during the war and across Central and Eastern Europe. And before that, across America during COVID for years, unvaccinated until you could be. So you're just a tremendously brave leader. And then on the ground in Minneapolis, we'll talk about how you were actually shot at on live TV. I watched it with, yes, rubber bullets, but they're real bullets during the George Floyd protests. And on. Syrian refugee crisis from Turkey and Jordan, the Iran nuclear deal from Tehran, the Greek debt crisis in Athens, the funeral of Nelson Mandela in South Africa. So you've just really brought us onto the ground in so many places. And before that, or before MSNBC, you were at Al Jazeera and then before that, CNN's chief business correspondent, and in a number of shows there. You've won a whole bunch of awards, a lot of Emmy nominations, National Headliner Award for Business and Consumer Reporting. You won another big award last night here in Philadelphia. So fantastic accolades. You've been on Oprah, The View, The Daily Show with Jon Stewart. We might ask you about those. And you're also on the board locally of the National Constitution Center, among many, many others. Oh, and there's a couple of books, Give Me My Money Back, co-author also of How to Spend Money, and 2 books coming up, A Field Guide to Democracy next year and Open Space the year after. So in your spare time, yeah. Anyway, welcome. So the first half hour, I get to ask questions. And then as Mindy said, the second half hour is the audience. So my very first question, so you were born in Nairobi, you were raised in Canada. I wonder who or what inspired you early to take this career path?
I'm the child of immigrants, so no child of immigrants wants their kid to be a journalist. Let me tell you that. My parents would have been much happier if I had been a lawyer or a doctor or something like that. But my parents were anti-apartheid activists in South Africa. They ultimately moved to Kenya, and I was born right at the tail end of their stay in Kenya, and they moved to Canada, and they were very politically involved. My father ended up running for election and losing, but then ultimately winning. And I grew up in a political household. So the news was like a sort of a soundtrack. It was in the back. It wasn't really something we thought about actively, but we all watched the news. We in my house, we consumed the news much more than we consumed sitcoms or comedies and things like that. We watched the news together, and it was important to our decision making, or at least that's how my family saw it, that you had to be informed to be a good citizen. And remember, they grew up in apartheid, right? They couldn't vote or participate in the political process by virtue of the color of their skin. So citizenship to them was, and I don't mean physical, actual citizenship. We were in Canada, we are citizens, but this is the concept of being a citizen of a political entity meant that you needed to be informed and you needed to participate. And to me, the news was about that. That was the way in which you got informed. So ultimately, it was very late in my undergraduate career when I decided that I wanted to go into news. I dabbled in a whole bunch of other things, and it wasn't really going to be the future. I hadn't grown up thinking about it, but I did edit my high school newspaper, and I did write for a newspaper the whole time that I was at university. And it only occurred to me right at the end that, wow, this could actually be a career. And my dad sort of pulled me aside and said, "You sure about this? I mean, it's certainly no guarantee that this is going to work." And I, at that point, being a stubborn kid, I said, "Watch, it'll work."
And it's it.
So far.
So yeah, and by the way, I see that you had an undergraduate degree in religion.
Yes.
And I hope you draw on that, and
Well,
and the Knights of Ukraine and
part of
stuff.
the dabbling, right? I wanted to go to law school. I did ultimately, as an immigrant child, think I should go to law school. So I show up at my undergraduate university, and I had a friend whom I'd known from other political involvement who was just graduating. She was in her final year. And so she said to me, well, if you want to go to law school, you basically just have to get good grades to go to law school. It doesn't really matter what you study. And at the university I attended, there was a theological college attached to it. This is a legacy thing. And it didn't have enough courses to take if you were doing it as an intellectual pursuit. So if you were going into the ministry, you would go to the theological college and it had all these courses. But if you were doing it, a few students were allowed to do it just as an intellectual pursuit. But then you didn't take all the prerequisites that were for the ministry. And as a result, you couldn't fill a full course load at the theological college, which meant that they approved courses across the spectrum. So there were history courses, there were English courses. I designed the most broad liberal arts education that I could get. And you could only do that by going to the theological college. It allowed you to take more courses outside of your discipline than any other discipline would allow.
Interesting. And by the way, so I can just see you all sitting around the kitchen table. Did you feel like, what was it, Canadian National, the broadcasting system? Did you feel like you had one set of facts, one channel? Did everybody in Canada believe a set of facts?
Yeah, I mean, it didn't occur to me growing up. We didn't have discussions about critical skills in watching the news. Like, that just wasn't a thing back then. Maybe we should have, but there were sort of two channels at the time, two national news channels at the time in Canada. There are a few more now, but they all did the same stuff. They covered the same stuff. Now, in hindsight, what we didn't do in those days, both in Canada and the United States, is we didn't cover the breadth of society. We didn't cover, there were undercovered people. There were people whose lives were not told on TV, entire races of people, people's sexual orientation. I mean, the news was sort of mainstream, largely political, and about politics, and then safety and public service stuff. It didn't do that many deep dives. Canada probably did a slightly better job than America did. But if the criticism of the news in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s and on was that it didn't cover enough stuff, that's really valid. It didn't cover the range of human experience in Canada or the United States or Great Britain. But they weren't lying to you. Generally speaking, the only accusation is they didn't tell you enough. It wasn't dishonest. Whether you watch this channel or that channel, you fundamentally got the same information.
Interesting. Okay, so then you found your way from Canada to CNN, and I gather it was on a pretty dramatic day or time. So how did you do that, and how did you get there, and why? And also, then why did you get in, or how did you get into business reporting?
So I had been a business reporter in Canada, and the reason for that is that I got hired by a television station that, in the trading activity of the late 90s, had decided that they had the spectrum, they had a channel, and they were going to sort of design it. It was a news channel, but they were going to design it around this idea of what CNBC looked like or Bloomberg looked like. It had tickers and all that kind of stuff. So they give you news and weather, but fundamentally during the day, it was business programming. And someone said, would you like to come and work for us? And I said, I know nothing about business. And they said, we'll teach you. We've got good producers. You just listen to them. But we'll teach you. But back in the day, and you probably remember this, business reporters before CNBC and Bloomberg largely were old men who had some connection to the business world, who would sit and do a little segment on the local news about what it means today. The stock market did this, the price of gold did that, the price of oil did this. There wasn't a broad specialty around business news. So we needed so many people to join the profession that I was invited to do so. And then I worked for another all business channel in the United States. And in 2001, CNN Financial News, which doesn't exist anymore, but they existed at the time, they came knocking and offered me a job. And I was supposed to start my work on September 10th, 2001, 21 years ago. And on September 7th, I think that was a Friday, I arrived in New York after having traveled overseas for about a month, just, touring. And I arrived at JFK and they said, your visa is not processed yet. And, normally Canadians and Americans don't need visas to go to each other's country, but when you're moving to a country, I needed a visa. And they said, it's not processed, so you need to go back to Canada. It's just a technicality. It'll be done in a couple of days. So Friday and Monday, CNN was on the phone with its lawyers, with what was called the INS at the time, the Immigration and Naturalization Service. And they said, look, it's a small matter. It's going to be sorted out. Tuesday, September 11th, my visa got sorted out at about 8:45 in the morning.
Wow. Wow.
I'm in Toronto. As we all know, all the planes had stopped. Every last American who was stuck in Canada rented every last available car and was on their way. And my visa was in Vermont. That's the processing center that had it. From there, the normal process would be FedExed to Atlanta, where CNN's lawyers were, except there were no FedExing. There was no planes flying anywhere. And then it would have to get to me. And this was several days on. Meanwhile, CNN's calling me saying, you've got to get down here. You've got to get down here. So I had a relationship with the US consulate in Toronto. And I called them. I said, look, here's the thing. I've started this job. They need me to get there. My visa's in Vermont, blah, blah, blah. I told them the whole thing. And I learned something that day. They said that in that moment, right after 9/11, the ultimate authority as to whether to let somebody into the United States or not lay with the person in charge of any particular border crossing. And they said, we know the guy at Niagara Falls. He's on shift till midnight. If you can get there by midnight, he will let you in on the strength of a curly thermal faxed copy of my visa. So I had sold my car. There was no way to get there. I had a little motorcycle in my garage that had business being on major roads. And I got on the bike and I rode to Niagara Falls, got through the border. There was nobody else crossing at that point, and slept in a motel there, and then rode that little motorbike into New York on September 13th by the time I got in and started.
Wow.
September 13th.
Unbelievable. Unbelievable story. Woo. Well, we're glad you got there. I'm actually glad you weren't there on the 11th, but so Ali, you are so eloquent. You are such a natural. It feels like you came out of the womb just speaking eloquently, and
my parents would agree with that.
And explaining things so succinctly and so calmly and so comfortingly. Have you ever stumbled? How did you, were you a natural speaker immediately, or have you made errors, and how did you recover from that?
Well, first of all, I was very nervous. In my job in local news, which is where I started, I was really horrible. I tell my wife this all the time, and she didn't believe me. And then I finally found a videotape and played it once, and she was, whoa, crazy. I've met people on TV who are like ducks to water. They are on day one, and they're alive, and they're amazing. That was not me. In fact, there was an article in the newspaper that came out maybe 15 years ago about me, in which they interviewed some of my mentors. And one of them said, well, the guy's really dynamic and energetic and engaging, but the minute that little red light comes on, it all disappeared. Craziest thing. I was nervous. I didn't do well on this. And I one day decided that I can't do this anymore. I would get anxious. It just was terrible. And I told my boss, I need to see you tomorrow. My show was in the morning. I said, can we meet after the show? And he said, yeah, come to my office as soon as you're done. So I had gone into work that morning knowing I was quitting. And I did my show, and I walk off to go to his office. He meets me halfway. He said, what on earth happened to you? And I said, what do you mean? He said, that was the best show you've ever done. And I said, really? And he said, yeah. He said, what do you want to talk to me about? And I said, nothing.
Funny. Why did you think that, do you think?
Because I didn't care. I didn't care about being nervous. I just
didn't care.
I decided I was leaving the industry. I was liberated. I was freed, and went and did my show, and it was the most fun I'd ever had. And I still feel that, like when I get in there, and I'm kind of annoyed because something's happened at the last minute, and I'm now being called to do something that I hadn't planned, and I've had to cancel plans, and I get a little annoyed. It's like I almost do better because I'm kind of not thinking about it as much, and I'm not as focused on it, and I'm not as concentrated. So, but no, I'm a cooker, and I've now found that works for that.
Yeah. So a related question, do you like the spontaneity of your interviews? Your interviews are spectacular on the ground, on the site, or is that more interesting to you and more challenging? And how do you elicit pearls out of people? Because you do.
I do like it a lot more than my scheduled interviews with people who have PR people who have notes, points they want to make. This is the best part of my job. It took me a few years in to realize that someone pays to send me all around the world to the most interesting things that are happening. And I just get to talk to people. And I do it across America now. I literally try and find people who hold no qualification to be talking on the media. They are just people. They are citizens. They are like my mother and father taught me that that is the ultimate good citizenship, right? The idea that you are engaged in the world around you. And so I try to find those people, whether it's here in the United States or it's overseas or Ukraine or the refugees who are coming over to Hungary or Poland while I was over there. I just think that if you really believe that the true stories and the real stories about what's going on in the world come from the mouths of actual people who live and who don't necessarily have power and are often voiceless entirely. And if you are prepared to hand over your mic and give them a voice, which I think is a good thing to do, shut up and listen a little bit. The pearls are just from them talking. It's just their lives. It's just their stories. And they need a very, very big invitation to say, tell me what's really on your mind. Don't tell me what you think I need to hear. Tell me what you're thinking. And that means sometimes the interviews go longer, and it sometimes means before they're on TV with me, I get there and spend a good amount of time with them because they're not trained at this stuff. Sometimes it's just the spontaneity of it, but it is the most rewarding part of my job. It's much, much more interesting than interviewing famous people.
So in the White House and for Elizabeth Warren, they always, called them RPs. You probably know that, but we used to call them the real people RPs. And they always, Obama would say, I need RPs. I need my real people to illustrate. And that's, so the visual is so much more vivid. I mean, I think you said once war is on a map for most people, but it's really people.
That's exactly right. And by the way, this particular war that's going on, most people wouldn't have known where to find Ukraine on a map. So it's very hard to do something that's an abstraction of an abstraction and make it real, which is why I wanted to be in train stations, which is why I wanted to be on the ground with refugees, because that you cannot turn away from. You can't choose to, but you can turn away from a map. You can turn away from nothing that tells you what are NATO countries and what aren't NATO countries and types of tanks and things like that. Turning away from real people who are suffering is
Yeah. So, I mean, we've seen a lot of those interviews. I mean, we were all glued to you at 9 o'clock every night for 6 weeks over there. I mean, and I think you teared up in a couple of the interviews that they just blew you away, and all of us too. I mean, tell us about a couple of or one or two of your most amazing interviews.
Well, there's one that I just followed up on a couple of weeks ago, and it was a 15-year-old girl who had escaped with her mother to Warsaw, to Poland. I was there because Biden was going there. That was the trip that he made. You'll recall that day the Russians sent a missile just 16 miles from the Polish border, and so I was covering it that day. And this I had, through someone else, understood that this young girl was there, and so I invited her, her and her mother, to come to our where we were doing our show to talk to me. And she had been volunteering as a helper for refugees. She's 15 years old. She herself is a refugee, but that was her way of coping with it. She volunteered to help other people, and I had a great interview with her. And I don't know if the audience could see this, but while she was talking to me, she was crying the whole time. Like, there were just tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling and she was trying to get through it. And then at the end, I said, thank you. And I told her, your dreams are going to come true, and we'll be with you throughout. And she just said, can I hug you? And she did that on TV. Anyway, I found her a few weeks ago, and she's back in Ukraine, actually, because the Ukrainians are making some progress right now. They're taking back land that they had lost. So she had been reunited with her father, who obviously couldn't leave the country. That was definitely one of the biggest ones. The other one was the first night I was in Budapest, and it was very late. I'd been on TV for many, many hours, and I was walking backwards from the train to show people what happens when you get off the train, to show the audience. And the cameraman was walking forward. He was in front of me, and I thought I bumped into an elderly woman, and she said something, and she grabbed my hand, and I thought, what went through my mind is, oh my God, I bumped into this woman on live TV, and now she's going to berate me. And it turns out that she had a phone in one hand, and she was eating a sandwich, and she grabbed me as I went by, because I must have given off that I knew something about something. And she asked me something in Ukrainian, and I did not understand what she was asking me. It turned out she was asking me what the name of the train station was that we were at, because she was on the phone with somebody who was going to pick her up from the train station. But Budapest has 2 train stations. So she knew she was in Budapest. The train stopped in Budapest, but she didn't know which one it was. And this was live on TV, and she asked me what the station was. And I didn't know, so I did what every great journalist does. I threw my producer under the bus. I said, David, what station is this? And of course, he didn't know what station it was either, because we'd just been there covering these refugees. We didn't even know the name of the train station. This was day one. And so that was another moment that stood out. She was hungry. She was looking for help, and she didn't know what train station she had arrived at, and she had an elderly woman on her own, and she was going to have to make her way in the world in a country that doesn't speak your language, where your credit card may not work, where your SIM card probably doesn't work, and where you have left somebody behind, probably her sons or nephews or something, and she had no way to communicate with them.
Wow.
They were dead or alive.
Wow. Wow. So Ali, well, first, two things. What was it like living in Ukraine, and how do you deal with the terror, the fear? I mean, is it a mission you're on? Is it, how do you get through that? Why do you go right into a war?
Yeah, it's a little different. I do hurricanes and things like that, but you can always organize around there. You always know where the wind is coming from in a hurricane, and you know that you need a barrier in front of you that's safe. You can prepare for that. In a place where they're tossing missiles around, there's nothing you can prepare for. We have helmets and flak jackets and all that, but if you get hit by a missile, you get hit by a missile. There's nothing else to be done. So there's a heightened level of anxiety around that. We tend to, as journalists, when we choose to do these things, we put it in a little box and not think about it. But yeah, sure, that air raid siren would go off sometimes multiple times a day. Sometimes you'd go a couple of days without hearing one. But every time it happened, you'd have to don your gear. And yeah, sure. I mean, we were all around and not trying to make a big thing out of it, but it was obvious that an air raid siren went off. They don't joke about these things. And a couple of times missiles hit nearby, not close to us enough to do any damage, but in the general vicinity. And yeah, it does something to you. It definitely plays under the surface. Those of my colleagues who nobody will say it doesn't, but it's not just that. I mean, there's a trauma that comes from a lot of these stories, right? Including, sadly, one of the things I've been covering for many, many years here is school shootings. And it's the same sort of thing. There's a trauma that you kind of hide, you just don't deal with, but you have to deal with it because you are seeing sadness and experiencing fear on a level that's not normal.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're glad you go, but we're glad we don't go. So thank you for, carrying the flag. So switching a little bit to journalism and social media, your field is under a lot of criticism right now. And I wonder if you can give us any hope that the downsides we see there, the divide we see in the country, is surmountable somehow, and how.
Well, it is. And part of being in Ukraine really helped me understand that, because they're doing what Americans did in the 1770s. They're taking up arms to protect their own democracy. We actually have threats to our own democracy here. Sunday is 21 years from 9/11. We thought our freedom was under fire. Our freedom's still under fire. It's just different. It's not a bunch of guys sitting in a cave in Afghanistan who are directing it. We have people in this country who have taken away certain freedoms already. And I hope in Ukraine, it's obvious because there's air raid sirens and there's troops from another country who are invading your country and undermining your freedom. It seems less obvious to Americans. So I'm screaming from the top of every hill I get on to say, no, actually, democracy is under threat here and all over the world in a way that is unprecedented in this, or, well, not last century, but it certainly in the last 60 or 80 years. And I think we have to realize that, but we still do actually have the vote. So number one, I think the divide in this country is insurmountable. The media stuff is complicated. I think that, I don't know what we do with people in our generation, but we're going to have to hope that the people in the generation of students and younger understand critical consumption habits and make sure critical thinking skills are at the front of their agenda about how they get through life. Because the media thing survives because we do not have an informed citizenry. Social media has affected it. Cable news channels have affected it. But basically, we've created an environment in which everything my father said about you have to be an informed and active and citizen who participates is now that's been turned on its head. Now people listen to whatever nonsense someone spews them to make them feel better, and then they vote on the basis of that. And now we have.
Yeah, I mean, are you hopeful? I'm sure you've seen the numbers of new voter registrations, that huge numbers of young people on this Zoom, thank God, both male and female, gigantic number of new registrations of the young people and of women, of course, in particular. And then there's the thought that the turnout's going to be immense for a
I'm
midterm.
very hopeful about that. But let me just tell you what I'm scared about is if this doesn't cause people, if the fall of Roe, and by the way, it doesn't matter what your opinion is on abortion. That's not what this is about. This is Handmaid's Tale, right?
Yeah.
This is the taking away of rights, and it's a continuum. If you start taking away little rights, where does it end? It could end like Ukraine. It could end in an autocracy. It could end in a fascist society. Don't give up your rights to people. And I think people are getting that message. But one thing we have to all remember when we're sitting at Penn or we're sitting in Philadelphia or in our major cities is that there's a whole country out there that is consuming different information than you might be consuming. And you have to make it your job to make sure that everybody does know how to register and everybody does know to vote. And on voting day or advanced voting day, you are out there telling people they've got to vote. Pennsylvania is going to be ground zero for a lot of these. It was ground zero for the last election. It may be ground zero in this election, and it may be ground zero in the next election. So if you happen to be in the Pennsylvania area, the good news is it's a very exciting place to be. As it has
I
been.
totally agree. And I love that you said that because I tell our students that, it's really exciting. It's thrilling. It's an opportunity. It's on a silver platter, 2 of the biggest races in the country. So yeah, get involved. It's only 2 months.
Both turn on the same issue about election denialism and extremism. And, they got it all in Pennsylvania.
Yeah. I mean, not to be partisan, which I can't help myself sometimes.
You're either on the side of democracy or not. There's nothing partisan. I would love to be back in a world in which partisan discussions occur. I think partisanship is healthy for society. Right. That's not what we have right now. We got something way off the charts.
Right. I mean, depending on your side, fortunately, there's some pretty extreme candidates out there. But anyway, well, that's wonderful. Mindy, I'm going to turn it over to you and our field out there, which always has the best questions anyway.
Thanks so much. And this is fascinating. I know we could pick your brain all night and get some great questions. I'm going to go a combination of in-person questions and folks from Zoom. So our first question is from one of our executive MPA students. The question is, so during the 2020 election, you reported live from a barbershop in West Philly. Can you describe the preparation that goes into election coverage in a particular city?
Well, the preparation for that one was the actual barbershop.
Oh.
Wait, you're muted. Yeah, now you're muted.
All right, sorry about that.
There you go. There you go.
The preparation for that was the barbershop because it was an area that was crime ridden, and so we have security issues all the time anyway, right? It doesn't matter where we go, we have to travel with security, and in this particular area there were extra concerns that there might be random crime issues. So I actually decided to end up on a corner where there was this neighborhood barbershop, and we went and talked to the folks at the barbershop, and they said, all right, you're on TV a little earlier than we would typically be around, but we're going to open up earlier, and we're going to tell everybody that you're coming. And so they became our patrons, our hosts. And because I wanted to be in West Philly, there were a lot of issues pertaining to the election that it was relevant to be there to tell that story. And so that's why we decided to do it there. But, we think about all these things. One of the things I do, because I'm on the ground so much, is I try and make sure we're not just in those places that are typically TV friendly, that everybody's done shows from forever. I mean, we're not going to, to the steps of the museum or the most obvious places sometimes. Sometimes you have to go to where people live and are and suffer. And at the time when I did that live show, there had just been a police shooting in the neighborhood, and tensions were very high, and that's why I wanted to go. The tensions being high were actually part of the security issue, but I wanted to go there and say, I'm here, we're going to listen, we're going to talk, and it's how I think about how we do these things when we go into different places across the country, and I'll be doing it for the next 6 weeks or so before the election.
Great, thanks very much. For our next question, we have Joan Sobel, who is a friend and community member.
Hi, thank you for taking my question. When you're on MSNBC, sometimes you're the on-site investigative reporter and interviewer, and then other times you're the moderator and you're interviewing other people. And I was wondering, how does your ongoing role as an investigative reporter affect or shape the way you are a moderator, whether it's your own show or you're stepping in to be, Rachel Maddow for the night?
It informs. Thank you for the question, Joan. It informs all of it. So my being a reporter informs my being a host or an anchor. It's not the other way around. I'm never a better reporter because I'm an anchor. I'm a better anchor because I'm a reporter. I'm a better host or moderator because I'm a reporter. Because ultimately, my belief is that journalism exists for two purposes. One is to bear witness. So when Elizabeth said, thank you for going there so we don't have to, that's the point of journalism, to be places where your readers, your listeners, and your viewers can't go, won't go, but so that they get the experience of being there, so that when authorities lie about what's actually happening, I get to say, no, I was there, I spoke to them, I saw it. So bearing witness is the first part. But the second part is the holding to account, is to call authorities and to call people who tell you things that are not true, and to say, we know this because we saw it with our own eyes, our own cameras, our own reporters. So I use the material which I was gathering in the process of bearing witness to hold power to account. Now, you can do all that as a reporter, but it's so much better when I am moderating panels and I can call government officials and I can call elected officials and have them on. By the way, it's 2022. A whole lot of people just won't come on my show these days to be held to account anymore. But in theory, I can say, I saw it or we saw it, and here's the truth, and now let's get some accountability for it. So those two things go hand in hand. It's a remarkable privilege of mine to be able to be as much of a reporter as I am. Often in our field, what happens is you become less and less of a reporter over time, because you get stuck at a desk and you don't get out much, and every time you go out, it's with 15 trucks and lights and all that. So you're not really out there and being entirely accessible to people. I do it a different way. We're very, very small footprint when I'm out in the field. It's usually 5 or 6 team members in total, and the whole point is to be in the communities in which, whether I'm overseas or here, in the communities that I'm covering, so that we have real conversations with people. Thank you for an excellent question.
Thanks very much. We're getting some great questions. I'm going to combine a few that are around a similar theme. So we're in a highly political and partisan world. What should the role of the news be? Why has it gotten so political? Do you think we should bring back the fairness doctrine? Can we have a more balanced news cycle? A lot of questions in one.
No, the answer to all of that is no. Balance is not what we should be looking to achieve at this point, nor objectivity. There are lies and there is truth. That's the end. The gauge for good journalism should be not whether they are liberal or conservative, are they reliable? Are they accurate? That's it. The problem is we don't have gauges for that. We don't actually have a way to say, hey, there's this story about there being no water in Jackson, Mississippi. I would like to hear from the most reliable person on the story. And then let's say you put a slider on it and say, I'd like to hear from the most reliable conservative voice on the story, or the most reliable journalist who serves the Black community on that story, or the most reliable liberal or progressive on that thing, right? That's where your sliders are. But we should all be accurate. We should all be telling you the truth. So when people are calling for fairness and a lack of bias, they're entirely missing the point on this one. Our system is not suffering from lack of balance in the news. It's suffering from liars who are peddling nonsense to people. So let's not solve for the wrong problem. Our problem is not a lack of objectivity. Our problem is not is not too much bias. It is people who lie to people. Now, once you take that out, you'll still have bias. You'll still have a degree of polarization. That has been the case since day one in America and day one in every democracy. There are people who have strong political views. I don't believe that's a bad thing. I think I grew up, my parents grew up in a country where opposing and dissenting political views were illegal. And I believe in the freedom of speech we have in America, and I think we should preserve it. But we should be in an environment in which you can battle that out with people, and to suggest that the news has become the problem is the news is biased or has opinion in it or doesn't cover all sides of the story. While a valid criticism, it's not actually the thing that's led to where we are today. It's not what's led to the polarization. The polarization today is from actual lying.
Thank you very much. Great perspective. Our next question is going to be from Greg Schuckman, who is a 1993 Fels alum. Go ahead, Greg.
Thanks, Mindy. And Ali, thank you for joining us tonight and for being the comfort food for a lot of us who watch the news.
Yeah.
The question I have, actually, it gets to the partisanship question. And since you're talking to a higher ed audience, there's been a growing distrust of higher education by the public, and the partisanship, the partisan divide over whether colleges and universities are even good for America is growing and very troubling. So it was telling that in 1947, President Truman convened a commission on higher education, and the title of their report was Higher Education for American Democracy. Can you imagine? So do we need a refresh of that in 2022?
Again, it goes back to the informed electorate question, right, Greg? I mean, I don't know whether that's necessarily higher education, because you could create critical thinkers without it being about higher education, right? If we made that a priority in schools, but we're always deciding, are we dissecting pigs? Are we teaching kids coding? And in the process, some of the critical thinking stuff has fallen away. And as a news consumer, right? If you're young, a lot of your news is coming from social media, which is curated in a way that it wasn't when I was a kid watching TV with my parents. Everybody got the same output. Now everybody gets highly specific output. And so we saw this 3 weeks ago with the student loan forgiveness stuff, where in states where there were lower education levels, the elected officials from both parties, by the way, implied that forgiving loans for higher education was a bias toward people who were getting an education. And it's like, that's a weird way to think about things. If you wanted to say, how do we reward people for getting higher education, or how do we encourage people to get a higher education, that's a valid discussion. But to turn it on its head and say, there shouldn't be any reward for people who get an education. Our system demands that you get a certain level of education in order to get a certain level of income. It's not fair. It's not terrific how it's been, because there are people with university degrees who are still earning $7.25 an hour in this country, and all they are asking for is $15 an hour, which is $30,000 a year. So minimum wage workers are not stealing your wealth in America. But immediately people are saying this is going to increase inflation. We don't talk about inflation when rich people get tax cuts to buy airplanes. We don't worry about rich people spending to create inflation. We worry about poor people spending to create inflation. So we have this weird bias against the poor and the working poor, and yet we do not do the things necessary to stop them from being the working poor. That thing is, typically speaking, education. It doesn't have to be at Penn. It doesn't have to be, an Ivy League education. But are we giving people appropriate education for the work that is out there? The answer is no. It's a major economic problem. We also don't like immigrants all that much in this country, which is weird, because we don't generate enough people work that we have. So it's all tied in. This bias against immigration, this bias against sort of poor and working class people, and yet this bias against giving people a proper education. I think we need a real rethink of all of this, and it all does lead back to an informed electorate and making better political decisions.
Thanks.
Thanks very much. Okay, our next question is from Andrew, a Fels MPA student. So MSNBC has tried in recent months to distinguish between the hard news hours during the day and the perspective programming at night. You've anchored Dayside during the day, and you've also filled in regularly for some of the primetime hosts. Where do you see yourself on that spectrum? Do you change the way you approach your work depending on the hour that you are hosting?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. And I probably do. I don't do a lot of Dayside anymore, because I sort of live both on the perspective side and as a reporter. But my reporter side is not, generally speaking, perspective work. It's generally reporting. Those of you who watched me in Eastern Europe and Ukraine, the show, because I was anchoring Rachel Maddow's show, that delivered perspective. But the reporting that went into it from me was not. The reporting on the refugees was not. So I think that distinction's not as hard to make as one thinks. Many of my colleagues live in sort of two worlds. I also think that, in answer to a couple of questions ago, it's the same idea. We need to not think of perspective as a bad thing. We are humans. We all have a perspective on things. Even as journalists, we know we don't like hurricanes, and we don't like polluted water. We don't like tornadoes, and we don't like murders. Right? We can all come together on the things that we don't like. So where's the line as to what we don't like? I think, again, we have to be accurate. We have to present arguments to people. So to me, it was never difficult being a Dayside anchor in which there were not meant to be political perspectives in our coverage, versus being a primetime anchor or a weekend anchor where it's often built around perspective. I don't struggle with any of it, because in the end, my viewers should think, when I watch that guy, I'm getting the truth, or at least I'm getting something that he believes to be the truth, and I'm getting arguments, and that he will be open to debate. That's it. Doesn't really matter whether I'm delivering perspective or I'm just delivering hard news, if that's the lens through which I see it. And so that is the lens through which I see it. I'm comfortable on any front. If they told me tomorrow, go anchor 6 hours in the daytime, I'd have no problem. I wouldn't be watching my words and parsing it. I'd say, here's the news, let's talk about it.
That's great. We're lucky to have you doing that. Our next question is from Lauren Wilkinson, who is an executive MPA student here at Fels. So you've spoken about the power of citizens and the vote and participatory democracy. Can you share your perspectives on the current climate around voting and whether there are underlying disagreements?
Really?
Whether we live in a republic or a democracy. I missed that part. So.
Yeah, we don't live in a, I mean, the republic argument is specious. It's simply, it's disingenuous, and it's meant to be, and nobody should listen to this nonsense. When you gather liberal, conservative, and libertarian thinkers about voting in elections on the current issues, there's virtually no disagreement. This is not a country that suffers any meaningful election fraud that would ever be of any impact to any races that we're talking about. Voting is essentially safe in this country. It is a slightly disorderly system and requires some help. And as we've learned after the last election, it is susceptible to fraud, not from people who have a driver's license. That's not where the fraud in our system is coming from. It's from fortunately, a clown car of folks who tried to overturn the last election. But I'm worried that the next time around, they'll ditch the clown car for some performance racer, because everybody figured out what they did wrong the last time. We have a voting issue and a voter fraud issue, and it's from people who don't want to see certain outcomes in elections, or don't want to believe elections, or don't want to concede when they lose elections. That's what people have to realize, that for the moment, they still, the people, the electorate, the citizens of this country still have the raw power. They've still got the right to vote. Not clear whether, including in Pennsylvania, the governor has said he will appoint a secretary of state who can overturn certain things and take out voting machines and things like that. I think we have a lot of work to do. There are a lot of experts who have done a lot of work on this from across the political spectrum to say, here's the way in which we both secure voting and make sure that stuff like January 6th cannot happen again. January 6th ultimately failed because Mike Pence did the right thing in the end. And I'm grateful that he did. Our entire political system should not depend on that. And Mike Pence sort of went around and consulted with constitutional lawyers because he was getting the squeeze put on him by Donald Trump. And he needed the defense, the legal defense, to say, what you're asking me to do cannot be done. I don't ever want anybody facing that nonsense again, because we could have lost our democracy if Mike Pence had decided to ask the wrong people about stuff. So lots of work to be done. It is not a voter fraud problem on any basis, although somebody running for governor in Pennsylvania will have you think it is. The Attorney General of Virginia today just appointed a 20-member election integrity panel, even though there was no statistically important voter fraud in Virginia last time. So everybody's feeding this beast that there's a voting problem. We don't have a voting problem. The only voting problem we have is people not going out to vote.
Yep. Thank you. For our next question, we have Mike Holt, who is a Fels alum from the class of 2020. Go ahead, Mike.
Thanks, Mindy. Yeah, so I'm a Fels alum, and I'm currently working in public health. And I was just wondering, I know you've been on record a lot talking about single-payer healthcare, and specifically, growing up in Canada and debunking a lot of myths about it. So I was just curious, kind of, for your current thoughts. And most systems obviously were implemented in other countries decades ago. So just curious if you have any thoughts on if there's a feasible political path for something like that in the United States anytime in the near future, and what that would look like.
Thank you for the question. This is one of my favorite topics of all topics. First of all, almost every other OECD country has some form of universal health care. I like single payer because I grew up in Canada, but I'm not wedded to the idea that that's the way to do it. It so happened that Bernie Sanders, and every time I talk about Bernie Sanders, everybody says, oh, you're a big Bernie Sanders guy. I'm not necessarily. I think he thought through healthcare very well. He lives 50 miles from the Canadian border. It was the example he knew, and he put forward a plan that looked very much like single payer healthcare, which I I lent support to, because I thought anything that will break the back of the system we've got right now doesn't have to end up with single payer healthcare, but it should end up with universality. And we went down that road a little bit with Obamacare, quite a good distance. We're not there yet. And I think it's just a sea change in the way you think about things. When Canada and other countries decided on it, it was not obvious that that's what you needed to do. It becomes obvious over time, because all other OECD countries pay on average 1/3 of what America pays in total cost for healthcare. That's government, individuals, the healthcare system, insurers, everything. It costs 3 times as much to get the same healthcare in America as it does in other OECD countries. And the outcomes are not better in America, with one exception: cancer treatment. Cancer research and treatment is better in America than almost everywhere else at the high end. But most people don't die of cancer, believe it or not. Most people die of heart disease and diabetes. And we got a lot of heart disease and diabetes that nobody even knows they have in America, because people don't have doctors, because they don't have universal healthcare or even affordable healthcare. So I think the world has been our experiment. If you institute universal healthcare, you will have fewer people die of heart disease and diabetes. End of story. And then you will have a healthier society, and then you can start moving around the edges. It's a hard sell, because people don't know what they don't know about healthcare. If you haven't grown up with it, you don't know how it works, and you have people telling all sorts of stories about how people die in hospital hallways in Canada and stuff like that. I've spent a lot of time debunking these myths. They're just simply not true. The other one is, well, if Canada's healthcare system is so good, why do all these Canadians seek healthcare in the United States? And people give me the statistics. There's 2 kinds of Canadians that seek healthcare in the United States: snowbirds who happen to live in Florida or somewhere in the South in the winter and require a doctor, and people who live across the Canadian border who want a fast MRI test or an X-ray because it takes you a little longer. You can't get an MRI tomorrow in Canada if you're not suffering from something that would be life-threatening. You can drive across to Buffalo and get it. You can pay cash and get it. That's the only 2 kinds of people who seek healthcare in America. No Canadian would actually choose to give up their healthcare to come and pay for treatment in America. So it's a lot of nonsense, but I don't know. I don't know whether we'll get there. I hope we do.
Thanks very much. Next questions. I'm going to combine a couple again from our executive MPA students about how news channels decide what to cover. So do metrics at the large stations impact coverage? How do you prioritize and decide what to cover? And I guess, what's it like inside the newsroom?
Well, look, we're businesses, so metrics are important, but they don't find their way down to me. Right? I curate my own shows, and I don't have anybody telling me cover this, not that. We see ratings, so I can tell what people like and don't like. But what I've learned in the course of the last 5 years is that it's more important to our viewers, their relationship to us as hosts, and whether they think that we are delivering information with integrity. If you do that, they cut you slack in covering things that they wouldn't. So climate is a big issue of mine. When you talk to people who are experts on ratings, they'll say climate stuff doesn't rate. I don't even know that I believe that. I think that we haven't treated climate the way we should. So I try to. I try and deliver a lot of content on climate. I cover transgender rights a lot. Again, it doesn't rate. It's not that people don't like transgender people. It's just that they don't have an intersection point with them in many cases. I find that there's a way of telling stories in which you can let people know that these are social justice issues, these are economic justice issues, these are justice issues, these are political justice issues. And they start to see things through that lens, and they say, you know what, Velshi's talking about it, or Rachel's talking about it, or Lawrence or Chris are talking about it. Let me tune in and listen. And the obligation we owe the viewer is to do the hard work and to make it very, very accessible, to create an on-ramp into that conversation. And then I think this issue, whether it's likely to rate or not, falls to the side. It becomes part of a narrative and a continuity in your coverage about the things that you have telegraphed to your viewers are important to you. So for me, it's democracy and justice and equality. And I can fit anything into that category. Anything anybody's asked me about tonight can go into that category. So as long as I do that, my audience will tolerate it and possibly embrace it.
That's a great answer. Our next question is from Stephen Silverman, who's an executive MPA student at Fels. And so his question is, what is a personal opinion or hot take that you couldn't say as a reporter? If you answer that, we can edit it out of the recorded video if you'd like.
Right. Yeah, because that's likely that I'm going to answer that. I don't know. I have to say, I don't know that those things exist anymore, largely because of social media and things like that. I mean, you can't. There's no private group. There's no off the record. I mean, it's clear to us, for instance, when somebody says, I'd like to invite you to an off the record event, it's clear to us that there's no such thing. We don't do that. We don't understand it to be off the record. We may respect if Elizabeth Vale says this is off the record, I'll respect her view and I won't publicize it, but I'm not going to assume that it's off the record. And I don't know where that exists. I mean, once in a while you get these groups that record people and try and trick them into saying what they really think. I'm on TV a minimum of 5 hours a week and often 10 hours a week. I got space to say everything I want to say and more. So I don't have something that I don't say. People think that, and I go out, I'll meet people socially and they'll say, tell me what you really think. It's like, I tell you what I really think all the time.
That's great.
Wonderful. Wow, we love you.
Okay, our next question. So many, it's about one of the full-time MPA students. Many of the students here at Fels will end up in jobs working in the government. What should future bureaucrats or government employees understand about how the media works behind the scenes and how to get stories told on television?
Well, first of all, understand that that's noble work, right? We've gone through a few years of people calling it all sorts of names and disrespecting government work and civil service. Civil service is civil society, right? That's the thing that keeps us going between elections. When political winds sway, it is government employees who keep this country going. And so thank you for those of you who are going to go into public service, understand how important it is. I really, a lot of my favorite guests are people who are government experts who work for the government, whether it's climate or social justice. These are people who study and they know their topic really well. And I think the world is, I had an earlier question about the disdain that's developing for expertise in higher education. I think there's a parallel track that's going on where there are people who are really, really interested in experts and people who bring their passion, not just to the private sector, but to the public sector. So it's a broad question because I don't know what departments people will go into and what areas they will study. But I have found that peeling that onion, the layers back and going a little bit deeper and finding the people who are in government who want to have these conversations, whether it's on TV or on background, becomes very, very helpful to me because some of our best brains in this country actually go into government, despite the efforts of some to portray it as the swamp or whatever people say. That's just not true. People who are swampy just would skip that. They would go somewhere else and make their money. So I have found government experts to be amazingly helpful to our work and will continue to.
That's great. I know we're running up on time. I'm going to try to squeeze in one and maybe two more questions, but I know Elizabeth always gets the last question. So this one is from Abby Rambo, who is an executive MPA student. How do we hold those news sources accountable for lying and spreading misinformation? How do we reverse this new norm of acceptable lying in the media?
So it's the same thing. It takes an informed electorate. It takes an informed population, right? Because the only way you can shut these things down is if people stop consuming it. And sadly, I don't see that happening anytime soon. There are two other options. One is advertisers, pressure on advertisers. And that has worked in some cases where people have pulled, major corporations in particular, have pulled their advertising from news sources that are inaccurate. We're not fully there yet. But that should be an effort that the public is involved in. And the third one, of course, is something we're seeing right now is these lawsuits from corporations against news organizations that lie, and that hits them in the bottom line. But these are money-making organizations, and the only way to stop it is to stop the flow of money that goes to them, either from the people who subscribe or the people who watch or listen or read or the people who advertise. And it's a big effort, and I don't know how that'll go, but that's the only way to do it.
That's great. I think this is probably the last question that we have time for, but if we have more, I'll keep going. In covering breaking news, often you are covering traumatic or difficult stories. How do you take time for yourself to recharge in order to sustain your work?
Hard pass on that question because I don't. I need to get better at that. I'm not good at it. I just sort of work a lot. So I realize the importance of actually fixing that problem, but I'm in no position to give guidance or advice or even a good answer to that. But thank you for the question.
All right, I will squeeze in one more. I don't want to steal Elizabeth's question, but we do have quite a few questions from folks about what is some advice that you would give to folks earlier in their careers, or who want to make an impact on some of the issues that you've been discussing.
Study. The opportunity cost of getting an education is low. It's all I crave later in life is to go back and get an education, and I haven't found the time to do it. I got to teach at Penn for a few semesters, but I've not been able to learn. I learn obviously in my job every day, but I would go as far as you can go, learn as much as you can learn, develop as much expertise as you can develop, and then go out in the world and pay it back.
Okay, well, that leads to my last question. And actually I have two. One is, can you give us a couple of tips that you wish you could have given your 25-year-old self, not just study, but a couple of others? And then secondly, switching gears, tell us a little bit about your book coming up.
The tip I would give myself, when I started in this industry, there was no currency to having a commitment to ideology. I don't mean politics, I mean ideology. It's like, I certainly wouldn't have told you in the first 5 years of my career that this was about holding power to account and bearing witness and moving the needle and trying to get things changed in society. And now I meet young journalists and they're fully on board with the idea that it's an important job. You're not somebody who reads the news or delivers it. You do have to report on it. You have to report on it with accuracy, but your job is actually to create an informed public. And take that very, 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 very seriously. And that's not just as a reporter, but for anybody here. Take what you are doing really seriously for its role in the world and in democracy. When I started this career 30 years ago, I didn't think there was a fight for democracy. I thought that was over. I thought that was my parents' fight in South Africa. I didn't realize that to this day, I would still be on the front lines of a battle for democracy, not just in Ukraine, but here in the United States. We all are, and we will be for a long time. So understand that that's your role. You are foot soldiers for democracy.
Well, just on that point, I mean, you clearly have a mission you clearly have a critical platform.
And by the way, that's the book. So I answered your second question too. That's the
book.
The idea that you, as the most powerful tool we have to defend justice and equality and democracy and freedom, is you. So take it seriously.
Well, that is hopeful. That is a very hopeful way to end. So thank you for that and for all that you do, really, because this is a huge fan club here at Penn and really in the country, and we rely on you. So, keep doing it. Get some sleep. Stay out of wars if you can, but thank you, Ali, for joining us and for all that you do. Really a blessing.
It's a great pleasure to be with you, and I'm so grateful for this invitation. Thanks to everybody for taking some time to listen to me tonight.
All righty, take care. I know you're getting up at 3 a.m., but we're going to be watching you tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Take care.